Rita wasn't just any woman. She was the perfect cover. Sweet, damaged, and desperately searching for stability after surviving years of abuse from her ex-husband, Paul. And Dexter? He was safe, or at least that's what he made her believe. But let's take a step back. When someone has been through trauma, their perception changes. They crave normalcy, even if that means ignoring red flags. Rita didn't just not see Dexter's dark side. She actively blocked out anything that could shatter her illusion of a perfect man. Ever heard of trauma bonding? It's a psychological phenomenon where victims of abuse gravitate toward those who make them feel secure. That's why Rita didn't question Dexter's coldness. She mistook it for emotional stability, but was she really blind? Or was Dexter just that good? You have to understand, Dexter didn't just blend in. He mastered the art of invisibility. Raised by Harry Morgan with one goal, to suppress his darkest urges, Dexter learned early on that survival depended not on avoiding suspicion, but on crafting a mask so convincing that no one would even think to question him. And when he met Rita, she became the final piece of his camouflage. Most serial killers rely on intimidation or secrecy. Dexter? He took the opposite approach. He didn't need to hide in the shadows. He hid in plain sight. His secret wasn't locked away behind a double life like most criminals. It was woven into the fabric of his carefully constructed personality. And the key to that deception? Leaning into his weaknesses. Rita's past trauma had conditioned her to fear aggression. Paul Bennett, her abusive ex-husband, had taught her that anger, violence, and control went hand in hand. So, Dexter became the antithesis of Paul. He wasn't loud, he wasn't dominant, and he certainly wasn't controlling. He was quiet, passive, and, most importantly, predictable. This wasn't just luck, it was calculated manipulation. Dexter understood that people trust patterns. The moment someone acts erratically, alarm bells go off. But Dexter's personality was built on consistency. He didn't over-explain his absences. He never overreacted. He never gave Rita a reason to dig deeper. If anything, his lack of emotion reinforced the idea that he was simply wired differently. And here's where it gets interesting. Most people try to be the best version of themselves in relationships. Dexter did the opposite. He knew that perfection attracts scrutiny. If someone is too charming, too romantic, too flawless, people start looking for the cracks. So instead of covering up his emotional distance, he made it part of the package. Instead of pretending to be deeply affectionate, he leaned into his awkwardness. And it worked. Rita never saw his lack of emotional depth as a red flag. Instead, she rationalized it as a harmless personality quirk. He was just Dexter. Just a little odd, a little detached, but not dangerous. And if you think about it, that's what makes him truly terrifying. His greatest weapon wasn't his knife. It was his ability to make people underestimate him. But what's even more chilling, Rita wasn't the only one. If Dexter had been aggressive, secretive, or emotionally erratic, people at Miami Metro might have looked at him differently. But they didn't. His colleagues saw him as the quirky blood spatter analyst, the harmless lab geek. His friends saw him as dependable, logical, incapable of deception. And Rita? She saw a man who was safe, because in the end, the best lies aren't the ones we're told. They're the ones we tell ourselves. Looking back, it's almost unbelievable how many warning signs were right in front of Rita, yet she never truly questioned Dexter's behavior. But that's the thing about red flags. People don't ignore them because they don't see them. They ignore them because acknowledging them means confronting a truth they're not ready to face. Let's break it down. One of the biggest tells? Dexter's frequent late nights and unexplained disappearances. Any other partner would have started asking questions, but Dexter's alibis were always just believable enough. He blamed work. After all, crime scenes don't have a schedule. And when that excuse wore thin, he'd say he was going for a drive to clear his head. On paper, nothing suspicious. But in reality, it was a carefully controlled narrative. Think about it. Rita never once called him out for never being reachable during these outings. Why? Because Dexter had established himself as a reliable, no-drama kind of guy. She trusted him because he had given her no reason not to. And that's the genius of it. But let's flip the perspective. Imagine your partner constantly vanishing at night, never fully explaining where they've been. Would you be able to brush it off as easily as Rita did? Or would that nagging feeling in your gut tell you something is very, very wrong? And then there's the emotional detachment. Most people react in some way to tragedy, shock, or danger. Anger, sadness, fear. Those are all human responses. But Dexter? He barely flinched. His reactions were controlled, calculated, and unnervingly absent of real emotion. Remember when Rita told him about Paul's abuse? Most people in that situation would respond with outrage, or even just visible sympathy. Dexter? He listened, nodded, and simply absorbed the information like a computer processing data. It wasn't until he saw Paul as a threat to his carefully crafted world that he acted on it. And even then, it wasn't an emotional response. It was a logical elimination of a problem. The same thing happened when Miguel Prado was murdered. Rita knew Dexter and Miguel had grown close. So close that Miguel was one of the very few people in Dexter's life that could be called a friend. And then, just like that, Miguel was dead. Most people would be devastated, or at the very least shocked. But Dexter? No reaction, no grief, no confusion, just an eerily matter-of-fact acceptance. Rita should have noticed. She should have seen that Dexter's emotional reactions never quite matched what a normal person's would be. But she didn't. Or maybe she did. That's the real question, isn't it? Did she ever get that sinking feeling in her stomach? Did she ever lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering why Dexter sometimes felt more like a stranger than a lover? Maybe she did have moments where she questioned things, where she thought something felt off. But the mind is a powerful thing. It will rewrite reality if it means protecting what we hold most dear. And in Rita's case, she wanted a happy, normal life more than she wanted the truth. Humans have an incredible ability to rewrite reality when it doesn't align with what they want to believe. It's not just wishful thinking, it's a deeply ingrained psychological mechanism called cognitive dissonance. This happens when someone is confronted with information that contradicts their worldview, forcing them to either change their beliefs or distort reality to keep those beliefs intact. More often than not, people choose the latter. Now, apply this to Rita. Imagine for a second that she did have brief moments of doubt. Maybe she noticed Dexter's odd absences, his lack of emotional responses, or the way he never really seemed present. A small voice in the back of her head might have whispered, "Something's off." But what happens next? Her brain shuts it down. Because to accept that something was off would mean entertaining the possibility that Dexter wasn't who she thought he was. And that was simply too dangerous a thought. Rita had already reconstructed her life once, escaping from Paul's abuse and building a stable, loving home for her children. She needed Dexter to be the man she thought he was. He was her safe haven, her second chance, the stability she had never known. If she allowed herself to believe, even for a second, that Dexter was hiding something truly sinister, it would have shattered her world. So instead, her mind did what it had to do to protect her. People in cults do the same thing. Even when presented with overwhelming evidence that their leader is corrupt or abusive, they double down on their loyalty instead of questioning their beliefs. It's not stupidity, it's psychological self-preservation. Rita's case wasn't much different. She was protecting herself from the unbearable truth. But at what cost? Because ignoring the truth doesn't make it disappear. It only makes it hit harder when reality finally breaks through the illusion. Now, let's talk about Dexter's second season. Perhaps the most dangerous time in Dexter's entire life. Miami Metro is on high alert. A series of dismembered bodies have been discovered, all tied to a single brutal killer, the Bay Harbor Butcher. Think about the sheer insanity of this situation. Dexter is literally working the case against himself. He's examining crime scenes, analyzing evidence, and even planting false leads, all while secretly being the very killer his colleagues are hunting. Yet Rita? Completely unaware. So why didn't she put two and two together? Because who suspects their own husband of being a serial killer? That's what makes Dexter's deception so perfect. Rita wasn't just not looking for the truth, she was psychologically conditioned to never even consider it. This isn't just speculation. Studies show that when people commit crimes, their closest family members are often the last ones to believe it, even when presented with evidence. We've seen this in real life, when serial killers like Ted Bundy and BTK's Dennis Rader were finally caught, their families were in complete shock. Ted Bundy's longtime girlfriend, Elizabeth Klopfer, lived with him for years and even found items like handcuffs and a knife in his possession. Yet, she still struggled to accept he was a killer. Dennis Rader's own wife and children never suspected a thing despite living with him for decades. Even after his arrest, they couldn't reconcile the image of their loving father with the brutal killer he was revealed to be. Now, apply this logic to Rita. Dexter was gentle with her. He was present in her life. He was calm, dependable, and structured. Everything Paul had never been. The idea that he was not only a murderer, but one of the most infamous serial killers in Miami's history? Simply impossible to believe. And the scariest part? If the FBI, Miami Metro, and even Dokes, one of the most suspicious cops in the entire department, took so long to piece it together, How could Rita have ever stood a chance? Because the truth is, she never had one. So did Rita really never suspect Dexter? Maybe, maybe not. But what we do know is that by the time she could have figured it out, it was already too late. Her tragic death at the hands of Trinity was proof of just how deep Dexter's secret life ran. If she had ever doubted him, if she had ever wondered what he was really doing at night, she never had the chance to find out. She died believing she had the perfect life. And maybe that was exactly what Dexter wanted. So now I have to ask you, if you were in Rita's position, would you have known? Would you have questioned the man you loved? Or would you have done what so many others do? Ignored the signs because the truth was too terrifying to face. If you've made it this far, the truth is clear. You're not just a casual viewer. You're one of us now. A dark passenger in the making. Hit subscribe and let the darkness in. I'll see you in the next one.